Hello, friends, and welcome to the June 14th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Engagement Director, and today's episode is being brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas. And friends, your Texas Impact staff is just starting to come out of our post-session haze, and we're looking forward to spending the next 6 weeks with our faithful Weekly Witness listeners doing a special Weekly Witness legislative wrap-up series. Beginning next Monday, we're going to have a series of exciting special guests join us to talk about Texas Impact legislative priorities. We'll also have Texas Impact's Advocacy Director Josh Houston join us to walk us through the bills that you worked on and cared so much about. But today, we're kicking off the series with one of my favorite Texas political journalists, Scott Braddock, editor of the Quorum Report, found at quorumreport.com. He's also the host of one of my favorite podcasts, Texas Take, of course, excluding Weekly Witness, of course, which we all know is all of our favorites.
Naturally.
Y'all, I'm not just trying to make our guests feel welcome. The Texas Impact staff certainly relies on the Quorum Report for information, and I do listen to the Texas Take religiously. And so we're big fans and excited to welcome to the conversation the other Scott for today. So Scott Braddock, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it and appreciate what y'all do at Texas Impact. And the Weekly Witness show going to be a lot of fun as you break it down through the summer, right? And you'll have another session probably before you're done with your series. We'll see.
Yeah, we were talking about what we do if the next session comes during our wrap-up series, but we'll hope that that's late.
As I reminded some folks the other day, they said, when is the special session? And I said, just a pro tip. Every session is special.
Right. I love it. And this next one will probably be extra special. We'll talk about that momentarily. So, Scott, I will say Josh Houston, our advocacy director, usually does the program every week. And the first Monday of session, I asked him how he was feeling, and he looked at me and said, "We don't talk about feelings on here." I typically ignore Josh, so except when it comes to legislative stuff. But hey, I'll rephrase it. How have you recovered? You doing all right post-session?
Yeah, you kind of try to zen out the first week once they're out of legislative session. There's always talk that this was the worst legislative session ever. This is the most emotionally draining and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of people before the session's even over pronouncing it, the most conservative legislative session or whatever. They want to slap some label on it. That's all partisan branding, of course. I don't feel like journalists ought to participate in that. It's okay to quote the lawmakers saying that, but I saw some folks saying before, we had not even seen what was the big conservative goal of the session, quote unquote, which was the elections bill, which I know we're going to talk about, but that hadn't even passed yet when people were saying that this is the most conservative session ever. And then, of course, we know what happened, but we'll break down the specifics coming up here in just a bit. But what you do, you kind of step back and let the governor do his thing right now. For the 20 days after the legislative session, the veto period going on and the governor signing things, maybe vetoing some things. We look to see if there's any, announcements there that might surprise us. This is a governor who doesn't necessarily get that involved in the legislative process itself while the lawmakers are in session. He prefers to, as a former staffer of Governor Abbott said to me, he prefers to make his rulings on the bills during the veto period. They called it the ruling period. And Abbott, of course, as a former jurist, still sort of sees his role that way. And he has said publicly that he doesn't think that his job now as governor is that much different from when he was a judge, when he was a state district court judge in Houston or as a Supreme Court justice here in Texas, that the House and Senate make their case on things, lawmakers bring him an argument, and then he makes his decision. So we'll see if there's any surprises in the vetoes that might be on the way.
So you did tease it, right? We usually, if we were talking about a book report or something, we'd probably start at the beginning and work to the end.
Yeah.
But we've been talking all legislative session about what was happening. We actually haven't had a podcast since Sine Die. Mm-hmm. And so I'd like to start at the end today. The big news coming out of that last weekend was the Democrats breaking quorum and walking out at about 10 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's when we learned that it had happened, about 10 p.m. Before the midnight deadline. The big thing still on the calendar at that point was Senate Bill 7, the omnibus voting bill. We'd call it a voter suppression bill. But walk us through what happened on that last Saturday night, or time. I guess it was Sunday night.
Yeah, Sunday. It all runs together, right? On a weekend like that, it's just Saturday Sunday is what it kind of feels like on that last weekend. Right. Certainly, this legislative session. It's worth backing up a little bit before that and explain how they got in that situation in the first place, and then walk through what happened that night. Look, this is an issue that is driven by something that is flatly not true. You have a base of a Republican Party, and not everyone who's a Republican feels this way, and they'll tell you that. But there is a strong contingent in the Republican Party that feels that President Trump, the former president, was cheated out of the last election, that there was some malfeasance, some fraud, widespread fraud that caused him to lose the election. And he continues to talk about it. The former president does, even though we're in June of the next year. And as you know, there's an audit going on of the count in Phoenix and Arizona. Even in the last few weeks, you see the president saying, well, that's just going to be the first domino to fall. And then you have some of his other supporters, some of these QAnon folks, the conspiracy theorists, saying that there was an event in Dallas just, I think, a couple of weeks ago where you had General Michael Flynn and some others and the chairman of the Texas Republican Party on stage there, Alan West, and a lot of other activists and congressman from East Texas, Louis Gohmert. They were at this event where they were talking about the idea that President Trump could be reinstalled as president any day now. And so they're waiting for that. So that's what's underlying this. And when you talk about election integrity, when you talk about ballot security, if you just phrase the question that way, are you in favor of making sure that everyone's vote counts equally and protecting the ballot box? Everyone will agree with that. I mean, they should, right? 100% of people would say, of course. Why wouldn't you want to do that? Well, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick said himself during a news conference a couple of months ago that in Texas, year after year, election after election, we have done two things: increased voter turnout and secured the ballot box. So it begs the question, why do we need any change to Texas election law? What's up with that? And I've only been able to boil it down to three words: avenge Trump somehow. And it's the somehow is why we get all the way to the end of the legislative session that last weekend you're talking about, that this becomes a meltdown and the Democrats were able to do what they were able to do on that Sunday night, which was break quorum and kill that bill. But think about 10 years ago, exactly a decade ago, 2011, when voter ID was passed by the Texas legislature. That was bitterly partisan, right? It was a nasty fight. Democrats were against it. Republicans are for it. But here's the thing about that. Everybody knew what they were talking about. There was no debate about what the proposal was. It was just, you have to show photo ID to vote. Now, there were some details that needed to be worked out. And I know people worry about equity in the law. For example, it's still the case that your hunting license, qualifies for voting and a student ID does not. And people will say, well, why is that? And they will say, but you know the answer. But at least it was a straightforward proposal that everybody understood. There was legitimate debate about whether it should happen. And I think in the decade since, there's been legitimate debate about how much impact it's had, if any, on the turnout in elections in Texas. And of course, as you know, Texas over and over again has seen various voting laws, including that one and certain areas of the state, the maps, the way they were drawn in redistricting. There were rulings that showed that Texas was, in some cases, discriminatory, in some cases, intentionally discriminatory. And the fact is that when those courts would rule that way, it wouldn't matter if it was intentional or not. If it's discriminatory, it has to be fixed. So voter ID was fixed in a subsequent legislative session, by a Senate bill. I think that was carried by Joan Huffman a couple sessions ago. But this proposal, election integrity, unlike voter ID, which was a straightforward proposal that had a heated debate around it, quote unquote, election integrity was so amorphous. It had no shape to it. This is why the Senate and the House started out in such different places. The Texas Senate wanted to do the proposal would have done things like cut down on minority area polling places, in areas where there are a lot of minorities who live in urban centers, for example. There would be polling places that would be reduced under the Senate's proposal. The Senate wanted to do, things like get stricter on the signatures on mail-in ballots and things like that. The House version was nowhere in the same universe. The House version mainly focused in, and it seemed House leadership was more interested in reining in some of the things that were done in Harris County last year in Houston,
Right.
To try to accommodate people who wanted to vote during a pandemic but were worried about being packed into polling places. So those things, of course, included 24-hour voting and drive-through voting. Drive-through voting, which was very popular in some Republican areas of Harris County, so it wasn't necessarily a partisan thing, but one of the members, former member of the Elections Committee in the Texas House, which if you talk to people who ever served on that committee, they'll tell you it's miserable. The Elections Committee is just miserable. It's a lot of conspiracy theorists talking about things that are happening in elections. It's a lot of folks fighting with each other. And this former member of the Elections Committee told me that when they served on the committee 15 years ago, it was Houston people fighting with each other. It's always Houston people fighting with each other. And if you look at the national headlines about Texas now, it's the same thing. It's Houston people fighting with each other. About what happened years ago, it was Paul Betancourt, before he was a state senator, as the tax assessor collector in Houston. The Democrats would say that he was messing with them when it came to certain things to do with the voter rolls, and vice versa. Now that the Democrats have taken over county government in Houston, but the House leadership wanted to do things in a much more restrained sort of way, do something that they would call election integrity, but was nowhere close to what the Texas Senate wanted to do. And when this bill was debated in the Texas House, there were some things that were added by Democrats on the House floor that some folks said improved the voting rights of certain people. For example, there was a well-publicized case out of Fort Worth where a woman had been prosecuted for voting in an election she was not eligible to vote in, but she didn't know that she wasn't eligible to vote in that election. And so the House version of this would have said that you would have to knowingly vote in an election you were not eligible in to even be prosecuted for it. So there was a lot of decriminalizing of certain things happening in the House version once Democrats were able to gain some leverage in the House process, without going into the whole weeds of that. But they did real legislative battle on the House floor. I was there with them until 3 a.m. and that was, I guess, a month ago, 90 days ago, whenever it was. Again, it all runs together on me. But when they got to conference committee on this, and as folks who are watching this know, conference committee is where the bill is really written. And a conference committee can take 5 minutes or it can take days or weeks. It depends on what the bill is. If the House and Senate come up with different versions of something, then folks from each chamber, the House and Senate, are appointed by the lieutenant governor and the speaker to go behind closed doors and hash out their differences to figure out what it is. And if you think about it as a practical exercise, I had a budget negotiator years ago say, man, this is the coolest thing ever. He was negotiating the budget and talking about the border security part of it, and said, the House version says we need 3 gunboats on the Rio Grande, and the Senate version says we need 5. How about 4? And they just work it out as they go through the budget. And all of these bills work that way. Well, the conference committee on SB 7, the voting bill, was a little different. It was acknowledged by the senator who authored the bill, Brian Hughes from Mineola in East Texas, that the conferees did not actually meet. They didn't sit down together and talk about what the differences were. It's not all that uncommon for conferees to not actually have a meeting, although on something so contentious as this, you would think that they would. But they didn't. Senator Beverly Powell from Fort Worth, a Democrat, talked about the fact that she was excluded from any meetings about it. She had been appointed to the conference committee, and Hughes acknowledged they didn't actually meet. And then on the Thursday into Friday of the last weekend of the legislative session, the final version of Senate Bill 7 comes out, and we got the language of that and reported it first at quorumreport.com. The fact was there were a lot of provisions in that final version that were never contemplated in either the House or Senate's deliberations. Now, it's not all that uncommon for a conference committee to come up with some other ideas, and that's why they have what they call an out of bounds resolution. It means that the final version can have some things in it that weren't considered previously. But there were things in there, Scott, like overturning elections was a headline on one of the sections. That had never been talked about in the legislative process up to that point. And what it would have done was allow for judges to overturn elections with no evidence of fraud. It would reduce the threshold for evidence of overturning an election. Which, if you think about that, the folks who should worry about that the most would be Republican incumbents, Republicans who would be the most likely to face some of these stop the steal, QAnon conspiracy theorist type folks in their Republican primaries. But you would think that Democrats could take advantage of that. Let's say last year in 2020, if that had been the law in Texas, that it was easier to overturn an election, I can count to 10 or 12 elections of state house members that it would have been taken to court right away in places like Collin County, Denton County, probably in Fort Bend County, some of the races in the Houston area as well. And so Republicans would have been the ones as defendants in those cases if that had been the law. On that Sunday night, after the Texas Senate had rammed this on through and approved the conference committee report. And what has to happen at that point is both chambers have to sign off on it. The House Democrats were in position to kill the bill. And I had looked at this, gamed it out. It had not, in my estimation, lined up anywhere close to what would normally happen on something like this, and even what I had thought would happen on it. And going back to the idea that the House and Senate had no idea, no idea exactly what this should look like and no agreement at all about what should happen. It's why the bill was able to be killed the way that it was, because if the Republican leadership had agreed, like they did in 2011, about what their voter integrity legislation should look like, that could pass weeks or months before this deal got killed at the end of the legislative session. So it really was a Republican disagreement that put it on legislative life support, as they say. Well, the Democrats had a few options. The Speaker of the House later acknowledged that when the bill came from the conference committee, after the Senate was in charge or was taking the lead on writing that conference committee report, Speaker Phelan said that thing had points of order all over it, legitimate points of order. Procedural problems with the bill that could have been used by the Democrats to kill it on the floor. And to
add to that, even typos, according to folks afterwards, right? Whether or not they actually were typos, but even after session, they were saying that the bill did not reflect what they believed it reflected.
Yeah, there has been a lot of finger pointing in the days since, and especially over the last week, as Republicans have taken more heat, particularly over that provision I was talking about overturning elections more easily. Texas House Republicans have been quick to condemn that, they have certainly been speaking up louder and quicker than the Senate authors and the lieutenant governor to speak out against that language. I think the final analysis on this deal, they could have killed it on a point of order potentially. There is a possibility that Democrats may have been able to talk long enough on other bills that were on the House calendar that day, other conference committee reports, to potentially kill the bill. There's a midnight deadline for passing those, for approving those conference committee reports on that second to last day of the legislative session, the penultimate day. But what they ultimately decided to do is the most dramatic way to kill a piece of legislation, or to delay it, in this instance, to kill the bill, and that's to break quorum. And in the meantime, the governor has said that the Democrats walked off the job and that they shouldn't get paid, and we can get into that in a minute if you want. But the truth is, they didn't walk off the job. A quorum break is a legitimate legislative maneuver. In other words, if you're breaking quorum, you are legislating. The Democratic legislators were sent by their voters to kill bills like that, right? And to pass things that their voters support and to kill things that they don't. And so it's not that they weren't working. They were just in strong disagreement with Republican leadership as to what ought to happen. But it's pretty interesting the way the quorum break unfolded. I think to your original question, when all of you watch the House proceedings, and I know this is a very tuned in audience, so you look at a lot of this stuff. When you're watching the House proceedings and you see when there's a vote going on in the House, and the members of the legislature, members of the House, are voting yes or no, and there's the big vote total boards behind the speaker, like a scoreboard, and it says yes, no, or present, not voting, the green, the red, and the white. In front of the speaker, there are flat monitor computer screens down on his desk there at the dais. And as the members are voting, he can see on that screen how they're voting, red or green on whatever the bill is. But there's also, and it's three colors. It's yes, no, or white, which is present, not voting. There's another color that the dot can turn that represents a representative. And I think it's pink. The fourth color that it changes to is if the member of the legislature pulls their key out of the voting machine. And the speaker can see that on his screen, that members are taking the key out of their voting machines and leaving. And what happens a lot on the House floor is that other members will vote for each other. Let's say someone goes to the bathroom or they run back to their office to get something or whatever. It's not uncommon for the other members to vote for each other on bills, and they can always change their vote later if they didn't vote the right way. But if they take their key out, it won't work. So he could see in real time that they were leaving. And as you know, the speaker had a closed door meeting with the Democratic caucus that afternoon, that evening. And it was difficult to piece together what was said in that closed door meeting. But I do believe, after talking to a lot of folks, one of the conversations that was had in there's probably a few stories out of that meeting. But one of the conversations that was probably had was at least one of the Democratic members asking the speaker, well, what if we just leave? What if we break quorum? And you have to imagine the speaker's being very careful about what he would say. He probably thinks one of the members is recording him on the cell phone. My impression would be that the speaker maybe smiled and shrugged his shoulders and then walked out of the meeting. Now, he was not heavy-handed when he could have been. The law says, the House rules say that he can lock the doors if he sees on the screen that they're leaving, and he can see on the floor that they're leaving. He can send the Texas Department of Public Safety troopers to go get them and bring them back. There are a lot of reasons from a Republican standpoint why he would not want to do that. Some of the folks who are on the speaker's team are people who were close to and on the team of the former Lieutenant Governor David Dewhurst. And you remember what happened in 2013 when he was heavy-handed about the filibuster of an abortion measure by then Senator Wendy Davis. It turned into a field day for Democratic activists, and Democrats raised a lot of money off of that, gained a lot of energy out of that. They were not able to translate that into an electoral victory, but they did get a big boost from the fact that the Republican had been so heavy-handed. Can you imagine what it would have been like if there had been TV footage of minority members of the legislature looking through the glass and trying to get out of the House chamber saying, "Let us out"? You can imagine a fundraising bonanza for Democrats, and even bigger headlines than they got. And they're already parlaying it into some more national attention even this week. I believe it's on Wednesday, coming up a couple days. They're going to be meeting with Kamala Harris, the vice president, at the White House. I think 10 Democrats from the Texas House and Senate are going to be there. And so it was a dramatic ending to the legislative session. I would say there were three big things to take away from that evening. One, Republicans in the House didn't have to take a vote that was a bad vote, because as they acknowledge now, that bill had turned into something that they did not intend for it to be. Two, Democrats do get even if it's a temporary victory, they get their victory, which is, for Texas Democrats, the victories are few and far between. And third, there was not an immediate special session, which could have happened. The governor could have said, probably there was about a 50-50 shot that he would have said, you know what, actually, we're going into legislative overtime. It's starting right now on the Tuesday of that week after the final day of the legislative session. But instead, the governor said in one of his statements at the end of the session that Republicans, Democrats, House and Senate, they need to work out some of their differences before a special session happens. And the rumors right now are that the first special session may be as soon as after the July 4th holiday.
So thanks for that overview. So immediately after adjournment, it might have even been within hours, the governor also made another threat, kind of in response to what happened that final weekend, but threatened to veto appropriations for the legislative branch. And I guess we have about another week before that veto period ends, and maybe we'll learn something. But walk us through that, and that's certainly something I've never heard or seen before. right?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's something that former staffers of the governor have said that they have heard him say before. It's something that he's floated in meetings previously, as recently as the 2019 legislative session, that he asked the question within his office whether he could veto the funding for the legislative branch. And if you think about Abbott and he has demonstrated this over and over again, and he's been criticized, on this point actually by some conservatives and from the right as being someone who's more authoritarian and prefers executive power to the dispersed power of the legislature. The governor had previously, in some meetings, I'm told, said, he asked the question, why don't we just veto the legislature's funding? And when he said that, there were folks around a conference table previously who said, wow, and then walked him through some reasons that would be a bad idea. But it's not like he hasn't thought of it before. This time around, he's using the quorum break as, I wouldn't say as an excuse, but as what he's hanging his hat on to be able to do this. But he sort of backed away from that a little bit in a television interview, I think last week here in Austin, where he was asked about it. And he said, what he would do is place that funding on the call for the first special session that ends up being called later this year, so that lawmakers could vote to reinstate that funding. Now, as a matter of being punitive to lawmakers, as y'all know, $600 a month is not much. And in fact, once they do their health insurance through the state, some of the lawmakers actually write a check back to the state. That's been a common complaint from some of the members. But the fact is that that's not the real concern for them. They're worried about their staff, people who live in Austin, which is very expensive to live. I've seen studies where, depending on how you calculate it, it can be as expensive as living in New York City, depending on where you are in Austin. And of course, we face a lot of issues, including all of the issues surrounding homelessness because of how expensive it is to live in Austin. But these are people who live paycheck to paycheck. Some of the staffers at the Capitol, I think that's understating it. These are true public servants, people who are working and not getting rich at it. And I heard from a lot of Republican staffers who were completely disgusted by the idea that the governor would even suggest such a thing. But I think it does speak to Abbott's authoritarian philosophy our publisher, Harvey Kronberg at QuorumReport.com, he wrote sort of tongue in cheek, said, well, if you can cancel out the legislature, why not veto the funding for the judicial branch as well? And then the governor can just decide everything on his own.
Yeah, that was certainly surprising. Best guess, right? What comes next? You've already said maybe a special session post July 4th. If anybody has the governor's ear, my family has a vacation at the end of July, and I'd still love to be able to do that. But what do you think comes next? Where are we going from here?
Well, we have to have at least one special session for sure, based on what Republican leadership would like to do this year, which is redistrict the state. Go ahead and do that. Stop me if you've heard this one before, Scott, but COVID messed something up. And the thing that it messed up that impacts the legislative calendar is the census last year. As you know, the Census Bureau had a real challenge trying to get their job done in 2020. And it's always a difficult job, but in large part because of the COVID-19 pandemic, they had even more issues. And so the Census Bureau information, it's sent to the state in two tranches, two batches, basically. We've already seen the first part of the information, which is that Texas will gain 2 congressional districts based on our explosive population growth, while some other states have actually been losing population. We've had just huge growth, particularly in Dallas-Fort Worth and in the Houston areas. And so you would expect some of those, you'd expect those new seats to be in those areas. We'll see how it shakes out. And with the congressional districts, that's something that has a little bit more urgency to it, at least from a legal standpoint, than the legislative districts. The legislative districts are drawn per the Texas Constitution. They're supposed to be drawn, and I should put it this way. The Constitution says they have to be drawn after the publication of the census in the first regular session after that publication happens. So there was some debate about that, whether or not the information we already have counts as publication of the census, or whether the information we will get this fall is publication of the census, which is the Census Bureau sends, the feds will send detailed information, actual data about our population in Texas. And they do that for all the states, of course. So they send the detailed data to the states that the lawmakers can then use to apportion the state with the congressional districts, the state house, state senate, state board of education. And if you think about what redistricting is supposed to do, it's supposed to honor the concept that's in the Constitution of one person, one vote. That's if you take out the, all of the partisan stuff. That, of course, we don't take that out when we do this in Texas, and they don't in other places as well. But that's why a place like Austin gets more representation than a place like Tyler, Texas, or you name it, right? And we're going to see, I think, a big shift in what these districts look like. Now, for the state house districts, the Texas Constitution has, I'll give you the simple version, it has what they call the county line rule, which means that the lawmakers need to try to keep the counties as whole as possible when they draw the state house districts. But for the other districts I mentioned, they're not bound by that. And the congressionals aren't bound by any of that at all. And so this is where the politicians pick the voters instead of the other way around. And Republicans would like to do this year, I think, for this reason. Think about what's going on in Washington. You keep hearing about, and you'll hear more about it this week as some of our legislators from Texas visit with Vice President Harris, and they go and talk to people like Senator Joe Manchin, who's sort of the, I guess he's the linchpin of the U.S. Senate, is the Democrat who has been very frustrating to Democrats and things that they're trying to do. But they're trying to pass a couple of big pieces of voting legislation in Washington, right? One is I believe they're calling it For the People Act, which has to do with more funding for voting operations. And it's actually sort of, the way one person described it to me, is like a Christmas tree bill for every wish list thing that Democrats ever wanted to do about voting. And while that's all well and good from a Democrat's perspective, the bill that has the most significance for a place like Texas is what's proposed as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would do one key thing. And this is why you would think Texas Republicans are in a hurry to do redistricting this year, when under the Texas Constitution, they could just wait till 2023 to do it potentially. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act includes reinstating preclearance by the Justice Department of voting laws in Texas and other states with a history of discriminatory practices in voting in elections. And so that is sort of the race right now, where you have Democrats in Washington who have majorities in the House and Senate who are not moving forward with that. It's blocked for right now because of the filibuster rules in the U.S. Senate. But just for perspective, and I wouldn't advocate for getting rid of the filibuster, although I recognize there are some good arguments in favor of that. In Texas, there are folks who feel the same way about various issues, who are frustrated with the U.S. Senate's filibuster, who would love to see the Texas Senate go back to the way it used to do business, which is to have a 2/3 rule for legislation to move forward. It was the case until 2015. The last session where we had the 2/3 rule was in 2013, before Lieutenant Governor Patrick ascended to the presiding officer's chair. It was the rule that 2/3 of senators who were present had to agree to bring a bill forward for debate before it could even be debated and voted on. And of course, it still takes just a simple majority to pass the bill. But just for perspective, when it came to something fundamental on voting, in 2011, which we mentioned, the voter ID law, to pass that law, it was former state Senator Tommy Williams who proposed, and they adopted it in the rules of the Senate in 2011, that there would be one piece of legislation that would be exempted from the 2/3 rule. You know what it was? You want to guess?
Was it voting?
It was voter ID, right? And so if they can do an exception for voter ID in Texas to the 2/3 rule, you could make an argument easily that in Washington, they could make an exception for preclearance, the Justice Department in states that have a history of discrimination in elections, that they could move forward with that and keep the filibuster intact otherwise. And folks like Joe Manchin could sleep at night, and we could get back to where these rules in Texas and changes to voting laws in Texas and other southern states, other places with that kind of history, would have to get that kind of preclearance from the Justice Department.
So I want to shift topics a little bit, bring us back towards the beginning of legislative session. Josh, when he talks about session, talks about kind of thirds, right? So the first third is them getting organized and building relationships, and the middle third is committee work, and the final third is largely stuff passing on the floor. And I've heard you talk multiple times about the importance of that first third, those beginning months and the importance of that relationship building and how COVID impacted a lot of that work that might have led to some of these, challenges toward the end. So for this audience, can you say a few words about the importance of those relationships and how COVID might have impacted it?
Oh, it's hard to really say enough about that. It's a great question because I worried about this going into the legislative session, and the reason I'm concerned about it is because we do have a long tradition in Texas. With as much as there are certain people working every day during legislative sessions and in the interim as well, there are certainly people working all the time to try to make this more like Washington. But we do have a long tradition of not working that way. And you know that former Speaker Pete Laney, the last Democrat to hold that position in the Texas House, he had said, part of the whole idea of sending George W. Bush to Washington was we would export Texas politics nationally, and instead we've done the opposite. We've imported national politics, on so many occasions. And leading into the session, I was really worried, and this is something I've seen, it's a trend, and I'm sure that I'm nowhere close to the first person to say this, but the way people behave on social media, on Facebook and on Twitter, it can really just breed such a toxic environment where the keyboard warriors are happy to say whatever to you when they don't have to look you in the eye. And when they've never sat and had a drink with you, sat and, broke bread, have dinner, just meet socially and talk about, the kids' soccer league that your son is in or whatever, and really know the person. If you really know somebody, it is much more difficult to, you can't dehumanize them and boil them down to one political argument. But if you only talk to them on social media and you never hang out on the floor of the Texas House or the Texas Senate and don't really get to know each other, it's a lot easier to just rip each other up and be partisan in a way that is more like what goes on in Washington. And, years ago, they changed things. It wasn't always that way in Washington. They changed things in Washington. For example, they took away the ability of the members to do deals with each other and work with each other on different budget items in Washington, what's criticized as earmarks, which I guess they've talked about, bringing back in Washington. But it used to be the case that Republicans and Democrats would get together and work on different things that have a reason to talk to each other. And now they just don't. One former state legislator who went to Washington a few years back had said to me fairly recently that, you could be in Washington as a member of the Republican or Democratic Party. You could be there for 6 months or more and never hear a member of the opposition party speak unless it was on a microphone or on television. You would just have no reason to have a meeting with them or talk to them anywhere. And so in Austin, because of the pandemic, because things were very restricted and they weren't spending much time on the floor and they weren't doing the normal dinners or social events, they would have happy hours or, different receptions for people to go to, whether that would be, something hosted by their caucus or something hosted by, their local government. Maybe it's the Frisco Chamber of Commerce Day, or it's the, it's the San Marcos, Economic Development Corporation's Day or whatever. People would do all of these events, get to know each other. And one thing that happens, and we saw this through the middle and end of the legislative session, is that because of that, because they don't know each other, they don't feel as personally responsible and accountable to each other, as you and I would if we had a real relationship and a real friendship and a good working relationship and really know each other. And so what would happen a lot this session during committee meetings where, say, a chairman thinks, because he's asked the members what they think about a certain piece of legislation, the chairman may think that there are enough votes to pass a bill out of a committee. And that's usually a pretty easy thing for the chairman to figure out. I wouldn't see stumbles on this a lot during past legislative sessions. Not that it never happened, but in the Texas legislature, in the committees, they generally don't vote on the bill unless there's a majority for it to move it forward. And they kept this kept being a problem, and it was because members had promised that they were for something and then just changed their mind. Because, again, they didn't feel personally responsible to the person. Maybe they had only sent a text message to them that said, yeah, I'm in favor of your bill. And later somebody else got to them or they changed their mind for whatever reason. And when the chairman would say, I thought you were for this, they said, yeah, well, I had second thoughts about that. And it just wasn't the same as when they have to look each other in the eyeball. And, it's legislating it's an intimate thing. And what I mean is that it is eyeball to eyeball. And when you have somebody who has promised they're going to vote one way, and in committee or on the floor they vote a different way, and the person who they had made that promise to can walk right over to them and say, "What was that about?" It changes the whole dynamic. And so COVID, in a lot of ways, changed that at the legislature, and I think made it, if anything, and hopefully this is not a trend, but it sped up that polarization and that ability of members to more easily demonize each other over partisan issues, and what I said about not feeling as personally responsible to each other.
I think there's a similar trend or a similar call to action, I guess, for advocates. And so, we talk to our folks all the time, our legislative engagement group members and faith leaders, about the idea that you can't just make a telephone call during the legislative session, that you have to do the work in advance to build a relationship with your representative, to invite them to come to your congregation and be a part of programming and tour your food pantry and do all of those things so that you have an actual real relationship when the legislative session begins. You can make that telephone call and they'll know who you are, right? They'll know that you're a valued member of your community. So I wonder if you have advice for the faith-based advocates that are listening into this program today about how to be effective at building those relationships, how to be effective at influencing public policy in Texas.
As the pandemic starts to abate here, and I know there are some people who feel like they still need to wear the mask even if they're outside and there's nobody around. I would take issue with that, but I know that there are people who feel that way. But as things get to the point where the vaccine is more and more evenly distributed and we come out of this, there's a couple of things to say about that, and it's a really good question. This has come up a lot during the pandemic. One is you've got to have a really good advocacy team at the Capitol, and folks who are maybe even willing to take a risk. I'll give you an example. I had noticed the fact that of all the teachers groups at the Capitol this session, a lot of them are rightly concerned about the coronavirus. And so a lot of these different advocacy groups were not sending their staff into the Capitol. And on the education issue in particular, there were a lot of things that were being debated at the Capitol that were not necessarily good for teachers, maybe not good for ISDs. And there's always different tensions about, what happens in the public education in that space. It was always the case that, and I think there was only, and I'll be corrected on this if I'm not right, but I think there was only one teachers group that actually had a staffer in the building for the last couple of months of the legislative session as the vaccine really started to take hold. And at the Capitol, you could pretty easily say that on most days that probably north of 80% of people had been vaccinated at that point. Almost all of the members of the legislature, most of the people who were there. Now, I think on the days where open or constitutional carry, for example, is being heard in a committee, that might change the percentages. But the fact is that for most days, you had people who were largely vaccinated at the Capitol, and to be there is real currency. I mean, to be at the Capitol, you have to be there to be able to see, things that are transpiring in the building. And heading into the legislative session, I had been asked a lot about what different groups ought to do to try to keep up with what's happening at the Capitol, and to try to advocate, on behalf of their members for the issues that they care about. It's a delicate balance, to tell people that they ought to just rush into that building when there are those folks who feel like, based on science, it's a petri dish and this is not any good. Well, I think on the one hand, you can't have it both ways. You say, we're going to trust the science, on the front end of this and say everybody needs to wear masks and everybody needs to continue to do events on Zoom and, everybody needs to space out and all of that. Well, the science is moving now in the direction of, as the vaccine is more evenly distributed, that we can get back to some in-person events and that certain restrictions can be lifted. Are certain governments maybe going too fast on that? I think there's a legitimate debate about that. But right now it's sort of a matter of respect, right? I don't necessarily wear a mask everywhere, but I always have one in my pocket so that if I walk into a business where the business owner clearly wants me to have it, I'm not going to fight with him or her because, they're just trying to run their business and make a living. There's no reason for a conflict there, but I have seen, I'm sure you have too, see some people not handle it that way. But I do think that nothing replaces being in the Capitol as all that is happening. And I saw it firsthand on issue after issue where certain groups were being steamrolled by others simply by the fact that they had their organizers, their advocates were in the Capitol, interfacing with lawmakers in real time. And at some point during the legislative session, you run out of the ability to do that. I think in the last week or so, and even maybe in the last 2 weeks or so, once the committee processes are all over and most of the floor debates are done, at least the initial floor debates in the House and Senate, once those are completed, and we're talking about conference committees and we're talking about how they're going to vote on, or maybe adding things or changing things in conference committees, at that point, it is so member to member communication only that you've probably, if you needed to take your vacation, those last 2 weeks, it may not make a difference, but I maybe not go that far, but I would say that, in past legislative sessions, when we didn't have this challenge of COVID-19 and people feeling that they needed to stay away from the Petri dish, stay away from the building, that folks who had good relationships with lawmakers, that they have their cell phones, that they're able to text with them and get information pretty quickly. Different groups had told me that, they knew they were in trouble during a legislative session when the closed door meetings are happening and those texts stop getting returned. Yeah. They were in some choppy water at that point.
Well, Scott, I know you have to take off for another engagement here very quickly. I really do appreciate the time, but any shameless plugs you'd like to leave us with today?
Oh, sure. I think you did one for me earlier. The Texas Take podcast is available everywhere that you can listen to a podcast. Give us the best review you can. 5 stars, not 4. It's kind of like, it's kind of like when you go get your oil changed and they say, you're going to get a call or you're going to get the text. What was the review? If it's not the best review possible, then we're all going to lose our jobs. That's the way they act. Give it an honest review. And if you're interested in what goes on at the Capitol, we'd love to have folks as subscribers at quorumreport.com. We'll get people signed up right there. You just click subscriptions on the homepage.
I will affirm both of those asks. Scott, really do appreciate the time today and appreciate the work you're doing every day to keep the state of Texas informed about what's going on in our Capitol. So
appreciate you, Scott.
All right. Thanks, sir. And friends, thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope that you will take 2 minutes after listening today to make sure, like you're going to do with the Texas Take, to make sure that you're also subscribing, reviewing, and rating with a 5-star review, Weekly Witness in your favorite podcast feed, and make sure that you're sharing this content with your social media feeds, with your congregations, and with your friends to make sure that even more Texans of faith are joining you in this work for a more just and equitable Texas. If you have questions or need more information about anything that we've talked about today, you can go to texasimpact.org or you can email me at scott@texasimpact.org. And finally, remember that if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregations are members of Texas Impact. We are supported by members and congregations like you. You can find more information or join us at texasimpact.org/join. Friends, the legislature has gone home for now, but the work for justice continues. So let's get to work. Thanks, friends.